Go over a little bit of conservation biology. Um, the other two videos will cover much of what I wanted you to know, but I didn't feel like they covered this last bit. So I want you to think about what makes something have value, what gives it value. Um, and we're going to just look at a few slides of various things to determine that. What gives this currency value? It actually doesn't have much utility, is what we call it. It doesn't have utility value. It has exchange value. People are willing to give you things in exchange for it, not that they can use it to actually accomplish something. So it has exchange value. All right. This next one definitely does not have, it doesn't have a life-saving utility, but its use, its actual use is what it's for, right? Like people make these things and sell these things because they can do something, right? In this case, it's entertainment. So this is utility value, that it actually has a purpose and it does something, and that's why people want it for that thing that it does. We could say the same thing about this, right? This is much more valuable than the last slide, but the same idea. It accomplishes something, and that thing that it does gives it its value, and that's utility value. Same thing with a home, right? Still has utility purpose. So we have exchange value and use value that we get out of these things. They aren't necessarily, I'm not necessarily saying one is better than the other, just that there's different kinds of value. What about a bee? What kind of value does a bee offer? We'll come back to this one. The way we look at it is in terms of conservation biology is we have direct use value, we have option value, and we have existence value. So these things are thought of as different uses that are out there. Now, some of these are things that we have direct use. What's in this column here, right? We can directly use cattle for meat. We can directly use trees for fuel or for building materials. Um, so direct use there, right? We also have indirect use. These are generally referred to as ecosystem services, things that have value because they do something naturally on their own that benefits the human population. The third group we have here is option value. Option value means it may have a future use that we are not capable of either harnessing at this point, or that we don't know what it is. Uh, and finally, we have existence value, and we'll come back to that one as well. Okay, so an example of an ecosystem service would be plants producing oxygen gas. If they didn't do that, human populations would be in a lot of trouble. But because they naturally do this thing on their own for their own reasons, they produce something of value for humans, an ecosystem service. Pollination, coming back to that bee that I mentioned earlier, right? Pollinators are so important for crop production. Now, not all crops require insect pollinators, but a lot do. There is, in fact, one region in China where its native pollinators went extinct, and they have to take paintbrushes and go and transfer pollen between flowers so that they can get their their uh, their apples to grow. So that would be a massive expense. And there actually are declining bee populations in the United States, where now one of the things that is beneficial to beekeepers is they can actually sell that service of what places where the native populations are too low. They will pay beekeepers to bring their hives to certain locations to pollinate fields or trees for them. So a major ecosystem service, and without it, it would increase expense tremendously for food production. Another example of an ecosystem service is flood control. So this is a flood that happened in 2011. This is what the Mississippi River looks like currently. This is what it looked like in 2011. As you can see, there's massive flooding in the Missouri and Tennessee areas of the Mississippi River. And this flood was thought to be one of the worst ever that they've had in the Mississippi River. It cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to correct the damage that was caused by these floods. These floods were primarily in the downriver parts of the Mississippi River. The upper Mississippi River did not experience significant flooding. There was some through the Iowa area, but not nearly as devastating as what we see here. And one of the things that was lost, an ecosystem service that was lost as as industry kind of took over the Mississippi River, is they took away the swampy areas. They drained the swampy areas. And there are multiple reasons for that. One, swampy areas are where mosquitoes could live, and that posed problems with malaria. So it was not good to have those swampy areas near populations. But the main reason why they were drained is to increase the amount of farmland. And so what they did is they drained these swampy areas, and then they built these these earth berms throughout much of that region. And the reason why it made this Mississippi flooding worse is all through the upper Missouri and upper Mississippi River, those areas have these berms built up to prevent flooding. If those berms weren't there and the swampy areas were still there, the river can flood into the swampy area and essentially increase the holding capacity of the river floods. And so the upper areas of the Mississippi River basin could hold the water longer. But instead, they're forced into their channels with these berms, and they're kept there. And so more water moves downriver faster during these flood times. And what happened is it forced all that water south on the Mississippi River, downriver. And when those same berms that exist in the southern part of the river, when it got there, they couldn't hold them back. The river surged. Even though they built up the berms, they never anticipated that it could ever get this high. And as a result, there was massive flooding, as you can see from this image, and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars were caused in damage. And there's that trade-off, right? We lost the ecosystem service of flood control in exchange for some farmland to drain those rivers. So there's a balance there, right? Do we take away the natural ecosystem and cost ourselves an ecosystem service? One thing that I want to talk about with option value is, in particular, biological insights. We didn't know about how organisms can do what we call phagocytosis, endocytosis, and exocytosis. We didn't know about those things until we saw them in bacteria. We didn't know about those things until we saw them in starfish as well. So we didn't know about these things until we saw them in other organisms. And those insights of learning about these other organisms let us know what's actually happening in some of our cells as well. And so understanding what's concepts from organisms that are not humans help us better understand what's happening to humans. Another example would be studying pea plants. Because of Mendel's study and the study of others who studied fruit flies, we understand genetic inheritance in a tremendous way compared to where we would have been without them. And so genetic inheritance, our understanding of that, is very important in human populations, and we wouldn't have that for humans, and we wouldn't have that if we hadn't been able to study these other organisms. Um, Another one would be first learning about axons, nerves, right? We did not know about nerves until we discovered them in a squid. But once we find them there, then we can understand how they work in other organisms, including ourselves. So a huge discovery there that was extremely important. Another option value is medicines. This is something called the horseshoe crab. It's one of the most ancient living species on the planet. They do not have blood like we do. Their blood is this nice milky blue color down here. What is done is they will actually take and drain the blood from these horseshoe crabs, not to the point where they die, but it's kind of like a blood donation they're giving to us. We can actually detect bacterial contamination using their blood. And so that's one of the great medical values that we get out of these guys. Another one, we learned about antibiotics from studying fungus, primarily fungus. There are a few others that we got from bacterias, but antibiotics changed medicine in the last 100 years, changed the way populations could grow of humans, and without them, we wouldn't have been able to be where we are today. So antibiotics was a huge discovery, a medicine. Here's a few other examples. We have hypertension drugs from vipers, pain relief drugs that we got from a snail, cancer fighting drugs from a scorpion, MS and HIV drugs that came from a cobra. So these are, again, other examples of medicines that came from organisms that you never would have thought we could get medicine from. Let's see. Let's go ahead and skip ahead here. Here's an example. Plants are particularly rich areas of potential medical use. Here's a few plants and their medical uses that are around today. There's some potential future medicinal uses. For example, if we understand how salamanders can regrow limbs, that may be a very significant medical benefit in the future. You can figure out how to harness that. Here's an overly simplified way to think about the value of the medicinal use of plants. Pharmaceutical industry was worth $497.5 billion in 2008. And 25% of drugs manufactured by pharmaceutical companies were derived from plants or synthetically copied from plant molecules. This is just what was made off of plants, right? If we just applied that to every species and its potential future use, you could think of each species being worth $15,000 just in terms of its potential pharmaceutical use, because we're already making 25% of our drugs from studying plants. All right, what gives this value? It doesn't have use value. It may have some exchange value, I suppose, but not quite in the same way as the currency. What gives this value is its existence. People look at that and they think it's beautiful. They see it in its form and they think that has value. That is something I want to be able to see. What gives this person value? When I talk to students about this, they'll often say wisdom. I'm not sure how wise he is sitting there smoking, but perhaps he does have wisdom. Human beings have intrinsic value. Mainly we've been focused on previously is extrinsic value, use or exchange. But intrinsic value is important to consider too. That the species that live on this planet, the ecosystems that exist, they have intrinsic value, existence value. having those things in our lives enriches our lives just by being a part of them. So that's something else to consider. That it's not just all about dollars and cents, but there is something to be said for having native, natural environments and the organisms that exist there, that they provide benefit to us, perhaps just through their intrinsic existence. All right, so that's our existence value, that last group. All right, the special interest group video, I won't bother showing that to you. It's a video by the church that talks about being stewards over over our planet and how we would be uh, we have an obligation to care for it outside of just what we can get from it. A few quotes that I like that I think reflect on how we should have our attitudes towards nature. Here are the stupendous works of the God of nature, though all do not appreciate his wisdom as manifested in his works. I could sit here for a month and reflect on the mercies of God. Another quote from Ezra Taft Benson, certainly not a hippie by any means, but I think an important concept that I like this quote because it cuts both ways. Surely you can see the inconsistency in the individual who insists we be good stewards and not pollute our environment, and yet who is unscrupulous in his personal life. Again, physical and spiritual laws are interrelated. Pollution of one's environment and moral impurity both rest on the lifestyle which partakes of a philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry. Gouge and grab now, without regard to consequences. Both violate the spirit of stewardship for which we will stand accountable. Now, I would suspect that many in the church would see this quote and would look at this for the people who have moral issues in their lives. But when I read it, I turned it back on myself and thought, perhaps I should be thinking about how I treat the earth, because Ezra Taft Benson says both violate the spirit of stewardship for which we will stand accountable. That if we are not good stewards and we pollute the environment for our own gain without any consideration for the damage being caused, that we are going to be held accountable for that stewardship too. So it's an interesting thought and something that we all should consider is, how am I holding up in either side of this statement? So I hope you guys enjoyed the semester. I'm sorry we had to go through this online challenge, but hopefully you were still able to learn and you were able um, to gain some insights that will be beneficial to you in your studies in your life.